Stay with me, because sometimes justice begins with the sound of a heartbeat fading. Beep, beep, beep. The rhythm coming from the fetal monitor inside St. Matthew Medical Center sounded weaker with every passing second, each pulse stretching farther apart, like time itself was struggling to hold on. Dr. Ethan Brooks stared at the screen in front of him, his jaw tight, his hands moving with calm precision even though his mind was racing miles ahead. The bright hospital lights reflected against silver equipment and polished floors, turning the room cold and colorless. Nurses moved around him in practiced silence, exchanging worried glances they tried hard to hide. Heart rate is dropping, someone said quietly from behind him. Ethan looked toward the hospital bed where Emily Carter lay motionless beneath warm blankets, strands of blonde hair spread against the white pillow, her face pale from exhaustion and shock. 8 months pregnant, 29 years old. Hours earlier, she had been planning nursery colors and arguing over baby names. Now machines surrounded her like silent witnesses. Ethan had worked emergency medicine for 12 years. He had seen car crashes on icy roads. He had seen construction accidents, heart attacks, storms, fires, tragedies arriving through double doors at 3 in the morning. But sometimes there were cases that made the room feel different. Cases that carried a strange silence with them. Emily Carter was one of those cases. "Come on, little one," Ethan whispered under his breath while watching the monitor. "Stay with us." The tiny heartbeat flickered again. Weak, slow, fighting. Outside room 304, thunder rolled across the city skyline. Rain tapped softly against the hospital windows, streaking the glass and blurring the orange glow of streetlights below. Midnight traffic crawled through downtown Manhattan, headlights drifting through wet streets like moving stars. Somewhere outside, people were ordering late-night coffee, heading home from work, laughing with friends, living ordinary lives completely unaware that inside this room an entire future balanced on seconds. Ethan looked down at Emily's chart again. Emily Carter, married to Richard Sterling. Richard Sterling. The name felt familiar. Too familiar. Sterling Capital. Real estate investments. Luxury towers. Magazine covers. Charity galas. One of New York's most recognized millionaires. Ethan had probably seen his face 100 times without noticing. But right now none of that mattered. Money didn't matter in emergency rooms. Expensive suits didn't matter. Last names didn't matter. Ethan stepped closer to Emily's bedside and noticed something that made him pause. His eyes narrowed. Then he looked again. There was a bruise near her shoulder beneath the hospital gown. Faint. Small enough that someone rushing through an exam might miss it. Ethan felt something cold settle in his stomach. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it had happened days ago. Maybe there was a reasonable explanation. But emergency doctors learned to trust instincts the same way firefighters trusted smoke. Sometimes small details opened doors no one expected. Ethan glanced toward the nurse beside him. "Who brought her in?" he asked. "Her husband called the ambulance," she answered. "Said she slipped at home." Slipped. Ethan looked back at Emily. Then he looked at the monitor. Beep. Pause. Beep. The silence between each sound suddenly felt much louder. Across the room, Emily's fingers moved slightly against the blanket. Barely noticeable. Ethan stepped closer. Her lips parted. For a second, he thought she might still be unconscious. Then her voice came out as little more than a breath. Weak. Shaking. Almost lost beneath the sound of rain against glass. "Don't let him in." The room became still. Even the rain outside seemed quieter somehow. Ethan stared at Emily for a moment, making sure he had heard her correctly. Her eyes remained closed, but her fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the blanket, as if her body had spoken before her mind could stop it. "Do not let him in." The words stayed suspended in the cold hospital air. The nurse beside Ethan looked toward him, but said nothing. Emergency rooms taught people when to ask questions and when to wait. Ethan glanced toward the glass door of room 30 for where movement passed briefly through the hallway outside. Shapes. Shadows. Hospital staff pushing carts. Family members pacing while staring at coffee cups and prayer hands. Normal scenes. Ordinary scenes. But something about Emily's expression felt anything but ordinary. Ethan looked back down at her chart again. Age 29. 8 months pregnant. Elevated blood pressure. Signs of severe stress. He had seen charts like this before. Many times. Yet there was always a difference between reading numbers on paper and looking into someone's eyes. Emily looked afraid. Not scared of pain. Not scared of hospitals. Scared of someone. Doctor, the nurse said quietly. Ethan looked up. Her blood pressure is stabilizing. He nodded slowly but kept watching Emily. Outside the room, thunder rolled again across the Manhattan skyline. St. Matthew Medical Center sat 18 floors above the city streets, its windows overlooking rivers of moving headlights and glowing office towers reaching into dark clouds. New York never slept. People said that all the time. But from up here, Ethan thought the city looked tired tonight. Exhausted, like it was carrying too many stories at once. He pulled a chair beside Emily's bed and sat down. "Emily," he said softly, "you are safe here." Her eyes moved beneath closed lids. Small movement. Barely there. "Nobody comes in unless you say so." A few seconds passed. Then she slowly opened her eyes. Pale blue. Unfocused at first. Then they settled on Ethan's face. Confusion came first. Then recognition. Then fear. Real fear. The kind that appeared before words did. "Where?" she whispered. "St. Matthew Medical Center." Ethan kept his voice calm. "You came in a little while ago." Emily blinked slowly. The bright lights above her reflected in tears gathering near the corners of her eyes. She looked toward her stomach immediately. Instinct. Pure instinct. Ethan saw her breathing change. "Faster." "My baby?" she asked. Ethan gave a small, reassuring nod. "We are monitoring everything very closely." Closely. He chose the word carefully because doctors learn not to promise things they could not control. Emily stared toward the ceiling. The silence stretched several seconds. Ethan almost spoke again before she finally whispered, "Richard called the ambulance?" Ethan looked at the chart in his hand. "Yes." Emily turned her face away immediately. Tiny movement. Huge meaning. Ethan noticed it. "Emily." He paused. "Did something happen tonight?" No answer. Rain slid slowly down the hospital window beside her bed, leaving silver trails beneath the city lights outside. Emily looked at the glass without really seeing it. Somewhere down the hallway, an elevator chimed softly. Distant footsteps echoed against polished floors. Hospital sounds. Safe sounds. Yet Emily's breathing became uneven again. Then Ethan noticed something else. Her left hand moved beneath the blanket and gripped something tightly against her chest. He frowned slightly. "Emily." Slowly she opened her fingers. A small object rested in her palm. Ethan leaned forward. It was a baby ultrasound photo, folded at the corners from being handled too many times. Tiny fingerprints marked the edges. Ethan looked at the blurry image and then back at Emily. She stared at it like someone holding onto the last piece of a world already breaking apart. Then tears slipped silently down her cheeks as she whispered words that made Ethan's stomach tighten again. He was supposed to hang this in the nursery tomorrow. The ultrasound photo trembled slightly in Emily's hand, as if even her fingers were struggling to hold on. Ethan looked at the image for a moment before carefully handing it back to her. Tiny shapes. Tiny shadows. To anyone else it looked like grainy black and white static. To parents, it looked like an entire universe. Emily pressed it against her chest and closed her eyes. Her breathing slowed little by little. Outside the room, a nurse pushed a supply cart down the hallway, the wheels humming softly against polished floors. Somewhere farther away, someone laughed for half a second before the sound disappeared. Life kept moving outside room 304. It always did. Ethan leaned back slightly in his chair and studied the woman in front of him. He had learned years ago that people often told the truth long before they actually spoke it. Fear showed itself in shaking hands. Sadness hid behind forced smiles. Guilt sat in silence. Emily had not directly answered his question, but her eyes already had. Tomorrow was nursery day, she said quietly without opening her eyes. Ethan remained still. Sometimes silence opened doors words could not. Emily swallowed hard. Richard kept saying he was too busy. A small sad smile appeared on her face for only a second. Meetings. Calls. Investors. Rain continued sliding down the windows beside them. Emily stared toward the ceiling again, but Ethan knew she was not really seeing hospital lights anymore. She was somewhere else. Somewhere earlier. Somewhere before tonight. "He bought a white crib 3 weeks ago," she whispered. "Imported from Italy." He spent 2 hours comparing different shades of white. Ethan listened quietly. "I laughed at him because I thought all white paint looked exactly the same." Her eyes softened for the first time. He said no. This one mattered because our daughter deserved the best. Daughter. Ethan had not known that. Tiny detail. Important detail. Emily looked down at the folded ultrasound photo again. I remember thinking I was lucky. The words came out slowly. I grew up in Ohio. My father fixed cars. My mother taught third grade. We never had much money. A distant memory seemed to move behind her eyes. Then Richard came into my life, and suddenly there were penthouses and private events and vacation houses in Aspen. She gave a tiny laugh without happiness in it. I thought I had stepped into a movie. Ethan looked toward the monitor beside her bed. Beep, beep. Stronger now. Better than before. He felt a small amount of relief settle inside his chest. Emily continued staring forward. People used to tell me how perfect we looked together. Her voice became quieter. Magazine photos. Charity dinners. Social media pictures. She blinked slowly. Perfect lighting hides a lot of things. Ethan felt that cold feeling return to his stomach. Earlier, he had noticed the bruise. Earlier, he had heard fear. Now he heard something else. Regret. Heavy regret. Emily turned her face toward the hospital window. The city lights reflected across the glass beside her like scattered stars floating in darkness. Do you know something strange? She asked softly. Ethan shook his head. I cannot remember when he stopped smiling at me. The room stayed silent. Beep, beep, beep. Rain against glass. Distant footsteps. Tiny sounds becoming enormous somehow. Then Emily frowned suddenly, as if something had surfaced in her mind without warning. Her eyes widened slightly. Her hand tightened around the ultrasound picture. Ethan noticed immediately. Emily, he asked carefully. She looked toward him slowly. Fear had returned. Stronger this time. Doctor, she whispered, before I came here tonight. Richard kept checking his phone. Ethan frowned. Checking what? Emily stared at him for several long seconds before answering. I do not know. Her voice shook. But every time he looked at it, he looked scared. The words settled heavily between them. Richard looked scared. Ethan leaned back slightly and studied Emily's face again. Fear recognized fear. He had learned that years ago in emergency rooms where people arrived carrying invisible wounds nobody saw at first glance. Emily was not remembering facts anymore. She was remembering feelings. Sometimes those were more dangerous. Ethan glanced toward the clock on the wall. 12:43 a.m. Outside room 304. The hallway had grown quieter. Overnight shifts always felt different inside hospitals. The energy changed after midnight. Daytime voices disappeared. Visitors went home. Cafeteria lights dimmed. The building itself seemed to breathe slower. Emily kept staring toward the rain-covered windows. Her fingers unconsciously rubbed the corner of the ultrasound picture over and over again. Small movement. Repeated movement. Like she was holding on to something familiar in the middle of uncertainty. Ethan spoke carefully. Emily, can you tell me about tonight? She swallowed hard. For several seconds, she said nothing. Then her eyes drifted somewhere far away again. Somewhere before ambulance lights. Somewhere before hospital ceilings and machine sounds. Dinner was supposed to be simple, she said quietly. Richard told me he wanted one quiet night together before the baby came. Her voice softened slightly. He even canceled a business event. Ethan said nothing. Emily continued. That almost never happened. Rain slid slowly against the glass beside them. Beep, beep, beep. The monitor beside her bed sounded stronger now. More steady. Ethan noticed and felt a small amount of relief. Emily closed her eyes as memories moved across her face. He ordered takeout from my favorite restaurant downtown. A tiny smile touched her lips for only a second. She looked down at the blanket covering her. I remember thinking maybe things were finally getting better. Ethan watched her carefully. Earlier she had talked about distance. About missed moments. About smiles disappearing. Emily shook her head slowly. No. Her fingers tightened around the ultrasound picture again. Richard kept checking his phone. Ethan remembered her saying that earlier. How often? Emily stared at the ceiling. Footsteps passed. Faded. Disappeared. Ethan watched Emily's face carefully. There was something else. He could feel it. Something sitting just beneath the surface waiting to rise. Then Emily blinked suddenly. Wait. Ethan looked up immediately. What is it? She stared forward without moving. There was a sound. Her eyes narrowed slightly, as if she were reaching through fog. A notification sound. Ethan remained still. What kind of sound? Emily swallowed. Not his usual one. Her breathing changed slightly. Faster now. Richard always kept his phone on silent during dinner. She looked toward Ethan. Fear had returned to her eyes. Real fear. Always. Ethan felt his chest tighten. Tiny details. Small details. Emergency doctors survived on details. Emily's eyes widened slowly. Doctor, she whispered. I remember because I asked him why he suddenly changed it. She stopped speaking. Her expression changed completely. Confusion first, then shock, then something colder, something heavier. Ethan stared at her. Emily. Tears formed instantly in her eyes. Because when I asked. Her voice trembled. He dropped his phone onto the floor. Emily stared at nothing for several seconds after saying it. The room felt smaller somehow. Ethan watched the color slowly disappear from her face as memories continued returning one piece at a time. Human memory was strange. Sometimes it protected people by hiding painful moments behind locked doors. Then one sound, one image, one tiny detail could open everything at once. The monitor beside her bed continued its steady rhythm. Beep, beep, beep. Stronger now. Strong enough that Ethan finally allowed himself to breathe a little easier. Emily looked down at the folded ultrasound picture in her hand. I remember hearing it hit the hardwood floor, she whispered. The sound surprised me because Richard never dropped anything. Ethan remained silent. Emily let out a weak breath. He was always careful. Her eyes drifted toward the rain-covered windows again. Tiny streams of water reflected distant city lights across the glass. Midnight had passed now. Somewhere below them, New York continued moving through wet streets and glowing intersections, while room 304 sat frozen inside its own world. I bent down to pick it up, Emily continued quietly. I thought maybe I could hand it back to him. Ethan noticed her fingers tightening around the blanket again. Then I saw the screen. He looked at her immediately. You saw something? Emily blinked slowly. Not much. Her voice shook slightly. Only a few words before he grabbed it. Silence filled the room for a moment. Ethan could almost hear his own heartbeat now. Emergency doctors learned to notice moments like these. The room changed. The air changed. Something important was coming. Emily swallowed hard. There was a woman's name. Ethan felt his eyes narrow slightly. Emily looked embarrassed suddenly, like she hated saying the words out loud. Maybe I was wrong. She looked toward him quickly. Maybe I misunderstood. Ethan said nothing because he knew people often started doubting themselves after fear entered a situation. Emily stared at the ceiling. The message said. She stopped. Her eyes moved slowly back toward him. It said, "Is she finally telling you tonight?" Ethan felt a cold sensation move through his chest. Emily looked away immediately after saying it. Maybe I read it wrong. She shook her head weakly. Everything happened fast. But Ethan had heard that sentence before. Not those exact words. Similar words. Different stories. Same feeling. Hidden relationships. Hidden conversations. Hidden lives running beside visible ones. Emily closed her eyes tightly. Richard looked at me differently after that. Her voice became softer. I cannot explain it. Ethan leaned forward slightly. Try. Emily opened her eyes and stared toward the hospital lights overhead. Like someone watching a problem become bigger than expected. The words settled heavily into the room. Ethan looked toward her chart again, but his mind was somewhere else now. Earlier there had been fear, then confusion, then regret. Now there was something more. Pieces. Small disconnected pieces beginning to fit together. Outside the room, footsteps moved quickly through the hallway. A voice spoke quietly near the nurse station before fading away. Life moving normally. Ordinary sounds. Yet Ethan suddenly noticed movement beyond the glass door of room 304. Someone standing at the end of the hallway. Watching. A tall man wearing a dark overcoat near the waiting area windows. His face partly hidden beneath shadows and fluorescent lights. Ethan frowned slightly. Then one of the nurses passed between them and the figure disappeared from view. Ethan stood slowly and walked toward the door, looking into the hallway. Empty now. Just chairs. Coffee cups. Quiet overnight lights. Behind him, Emily spoke softly. Her voice almost disappeared beneath the sound of rain. Doctor. Ethan turned back toward her. Tears had returned to her eyes. I just remembered something else. He stepped closer immediately. Emily looked directly at him now. Richard was not scared because I saw the message. Her voice trembled. He was scared because someone else was coming to the house. The words landed heavily inside the room. Ethan stood completely still beside the hospital bed, staring at Emily as thunder rolled somewhere beyond the windows overlooking Manhattan. Someone else was coming to the house. For several seconds, nobody spoke. The monitor beside her continued its steady rhythm. Beep, beep, beep. The sound felt strangely louder now. Ethan slowly pulled his chair closer again and sat beside her bed. Emily looked exhausted, but he could see something changing in her expression. Memories were no longer coming back as scattered pieces. They were starting to connect. Human minds sometimes worked like storms gathering over water. Small clouds formed first. Then suddenly everything collided at once. Emily, Ethan said carefully. Who was coming? Emily stared toward the ceiling lights. Their pale glow reflected softly in her eyes. I do not know. Her voice sounded distant. I never saw anyone. She swallowed slowly. I only remember Richard looking at the front door every few seconds. Ethan listened. Outside room 304, the overnight staff moved quietly through the hallways. A machine rolled past. Somewhere far down the corridor, a phone rang briefly before stopping. Ordinary sounds. Safe sounds. Emily looked toward the rain sliding down the windows beside her. He kept checking the clock. She frowned slightly as if trying to hold on to a memory before it disappeared again. Then he asked me strange questions. Ethan tilted his head slightly. What kind of questions? Emily blinked. Questions about our plans. Her eyebrows pulled together. Whether I wanted to stay in New York after the baby was born. She looked confused now. Whether I still wanted the house in Connecticut. Ethan felt something tighten inside his chest. Small details again. Tiny details. Sometimes people said more through ordinary questions than extraordinary ones. Emily continued staring ahead. Then he asked whether I had talked to anyone recently. Ethan looked at her carefully. Anyone? Emily nodded slowly. Friends. Family. My parents. Her eyes narrowed. At the time I thought maybe he was nervous about becoming a father. She gave a weak laugh without humor. I thought maybe he was scared. Silence settled around them. Ethan glanced toward the monitor again. Strong heartbeat. Stable readings. Better. Emily looked down at the ultrasound picture still resting against her chest. Richard was always confident. Her voice softened. Always. Rain continued moving down the windows like silver threads against the city lights outside. Board meetings. Television interviews. Charity events. She shook her head slowly. Nothing ever made him nervous. Her breathing changed suddenly. Tiny change. Ethan noticed immediately. Emily's eyes widened a little. Wait. Ethan leaned forward. What is it? Her hand slowly moved toward her forehead. The front door. Ethan stared at her. What about it? Emily sat very still. Too still. I heard it. Her voice had become barely louder than a whisper. I remember hearing it open. Ethan felt his pulse quicken slightly. Emily looked directly at him now. Fear was returning again. Then I remember footsteps. Her fingers tightened around the blanket. Not Richard's. Ethan frowned. How do you know? Emily stared at him for several seconds before answering. Because Richard always wore dress shoes inside the house. Beep, beep, beep. The monitor continued beside them. Emily swallowed hard. These sounded different. Thunder rolled again outside. Deep and distant. Emily looked toward the hospital door suddenly. Her eyes froze. Ethan turned immediately toward the hallway beyond the glass. A woman stood near the nurse station speaking quietly with someone. Blonde hair. Dark coat. High heels. Ethan could not see her face clearly from where he stood. Then Emily's hand suddenly grabbed his wrist. Tight. Trembling. Doctor, she whispered. I know that coat. Emily's fingers tightened around Ethan's wrist so suddenly that he felt the tremor move through her entire hand. Her eyes remained fixed on the hallway beyond the glass door of room 304. They did not blink. They barely moved at all. Ethan turned slowly toward the nurse station again. The woman was still standing there beneath the pale fluorescent lights, speaking quietly with a receptionist while adjusting the sleeve of her dark coat. Blonde hair rested neatly over one shoulder. Expensive heels. Calm posture. Ordinary details. Yet Emily looked like someone who had just seen a ghost. Doctor, she whispered again. I know that coat. Ethan looked back at her carefully. Who is she? Emily swallowed, but her throat seemed dry now. I do not know her name. Her voice trembled. I only saw her once. Ethan frowned slightly. Where? Rain slid across the hospital windows behind them while thunder rolled softly somewhere over the city skyline. Beep, beep, beep. The monitor continued its steady rhythm beside Emily's bed. Outside, Overnight staff moved through hallways carrying coffee cups and patient charts, unaware that inside room 30 a story was slowly beginning to unfold. Emily stared toward the hallway again. "About 6 weeks ago," she said quietly. "Richard had a company fundraiser downtown." Ethan remained silent. Emily looked down at the ultrasound picture resting against her chest. "I remember because I was 7 months pregnant and my shoes felt too tight all night." A tiny smile almost appeared before disappearing again. "I kept telling Richard the first wanted to leave early." Her eyes softened as memories returned. Everything looked beautiful. Crystal lights hanging from the ceiling. Music. Cameras. People smiling at us. She blinked slowly. People always smiled at us. Ethan sat beside her quietly. "Richard left our table during dinner," she continued. "He said an investor had arrived." She frowned slightly. "I remember waiting almost 20 minutes. Her fingers rubbed the edge of the ultrasound picture again. Same movement. Same nervous habit. Then I got up to look for him. Silence settled for a few seconds. Emily's eyes narrowed as if she were replaying the memory in her mind. The ballroom had these long white curtains near the side entrance. Her breathing slowed. I walked past them and saw Richard talking to someone. Ethan looked at her carefully. "The woman?" Emily nodded slowly. "She was wearing that coat." Ethan glanced toward the hallway again. The woman now stood with her back partially turned, scrolling through her phone. Still impossible to see her face clearly. "What were they talking about?" he asked. Emily shook her head weakly. "I could not hear much." She looked frustrated suddenly. Music was playing. Then her eyes widened a little. "Wait." Ethan immediately leaned closer. "What?" Emily looked directly at him now. "I remember one sentence. Beep, beep, beep." The monitor beside her bed sounded louder somehow. Emily's breathing became uneven. I did not think anything about it at the time. Her voice lowered almost to a whisper. "I thought they were talking about business." Ethan felt his chest tighten. "Emily." She stared toward the hospital door. Richard said. Silence. 1 second. 2 seconds. 3. Then tears suddenly filled her eyes again. Richard said, "We cannot let Emily find out before the baby comes." Ethan looked toward the hallway one more time. The woman near the nurse station had started walking now. Slow steps. Calm steps. Straight toward room 304. The footsteps grew closer. Slow. Confident. The sound of heels touching polished hospital floors echoed softly through the hallway outside room 304. Click, click, click. Emily's breathing immediately changed. Ethan saw it happen in real time. Her shoulders tensed beneath the blanket. Her fingers tightened around the ultrasound picture until the edges bent slightly under pressure. Fear had returned to her face, but this was different from before. This was recognition. Ethan stood and moved closer to the door without taking his eyes off Emily. Beyond the glass, the blonde woman stopped at the nurse station and leaned slightly toward the receptionist. From this angle, Ethan could finally see her face clearly. Early 30s. Sharp features. Calm expression. Expensive jewelry. Everything about her looked polished and controlled, like someone accustomed to stepping into rooms and immediately belonging there. She smiled politely while speaking. Ordinary smile. Ordinary conversation. Yet Emily looked like she could barely breathe. "Doctor," she whispered. "That is her." Ethan turned immediately. "You are certain?" Emily nodded without hesitation. "I remember her eyes." Her voice shook. "I remember thinking she looked familiar that night at the fundraiser, but I could not figure out why." Ethan looked back toward the hallway again. The receptionist handed the woman a clipboard. She signed something quickly, thanked her, and looked toward the patient rooms. Room 304. Ethan felt a cold feeling settle inside his chest. Tiny details. Small details. They kept coming. "Stay here," he said quietly. Emily looked at him with wide eyes. "Please do not let her come in." Ethan gave a small nod and stepped outside into the hallway. The hospital felt strangely quiet now. Even the distant elevator sound seemed softer somehow. The woman noticed him approaching and immediately offered a polite smile. "Doctor," she said warmly. "I was actually looking for someone." Ethan stopped a few feet away. "Can I help you?" Her smile remained steady. "I am looking for Emily Carter." Ethan watched her carefully. "And you are?" "Vanessa Cole." The name seemed to hit Ethan before he even realized it. Emily had never spoken the name out loud, but somehow he already knew it. Vanessa adjusted the strap of her purse casually. "I work with Richard Sterling." Ethan remained expressionless. Vanessa continued speaking. Richard called me earlier tonight. He sounded worried. Her voice carried concern, but Ethan noticed something strange. Everything about her felt practiced, controlled, like someone reading lines they had memorized. He said Emily had an accident. Accident. The word sat heavily inside Ethan's mind. Accident. Earlier Emily had said Richard looked scared. Earlier there had been hidden messages, hidden conversations, hidden meetings. Ethan looked at Vanessa carefully. Emily is resting right now. Vanessa nodded slowly. Of course. She smiled again. I only wanted to check on her. Then something happened. Tiny thing. Small thing. Vanessa's phone lit up in her hand for less than a second before she lowered it again. Ethan almost missed it. Almost. But emergency doctors learned to notice almost. A message preview had flashed across the screen. Only a few words. Just enough. Ethan felt his stomach tighten immediately. Richard, did she remember anything? Vanessa looked back up and smiled calmly. Doctor. Ethan stared at her for one silent second too long. Behind him, through the glass of room 304, he saw Emily looking directly toward the hallway. Her face had gone completely pale, because at that exact moment, Vanessa slowly turned her head and looked through the glass too. Vanessa's eyes met Emily's through the glass, separating room 304 from the hallway, and for a moment everything seemed to stop. The sounds of the hospital faded into the background. The elevator chime disappeared. The footsteps vanished. Even the rain tapping against the windows felt distant somehow. Emily stared back with wide eyes while the ultrasound picture rested against her chest beneath trembling fingers. Ethan looked from Vanessa to Emily and immediately understood something had changed. Recognition worked both ways. Vanessa had not expected Emily to be awake. That much was obvious. For the first time since Ethan stepped into the hallway, Vanessa's calm expression shifted. It lasted less than a second. A tiny pause. A tiny crack. Then it disappeared beneath another practiced smile. Doctor, Vanessa said softly. Is everything all right? Ethan kept his expression neutral. Emergency medicine taught people how to stay calm, even when questions started forming faster than answers. Emily needs rest, he said evenly. Tonight has been difficult. Vanessa nodded slowly. Of course. Her eyes drifted briefly toward room 304 again before returning to Ethan. Please tell her Richard is worried. Worried. Ethan heard the word and remembered the message on her phone. Did she remember anything? Not how is she feeling. Not is the baby all right. Did she remember anything? Tiny words. Heavy words. Vanessa adjusted her purse strap and smiled politely one last time. I should go. Then she turned and walked toward the elevators. Click, click, click. Her heels echoed softly against the floor before fading into silence. Ethan remained standing there for several seconds. Something felt wrong. Deeply wrong. He looked down the hallway toward the elevator doors just as they closed. Then he walked back into room 304. Emily was staring at the doorway before he even stepped inside. She knows. Emily whispered immediately. Ethan frowned. What do you mean? Emily's eyes filled with tears again. She looked at me like she already knew I would be here. Her voice shook. Not surprised. Not worried. She swallowed hard. Like she was checking something. Ethan sat beside the bed slowly. The monitor beside her continued its steady rhythm. Beep, beep, beep. Strong. Stable. Fighting. Emily looked down at the ultrasound picture again. Doctor, she whispered. I do not think Richard was hiding an affair. Ethan looked at her carefully. What do you think he was hiding? Rain slid down the windows overlooking Manhattan while thunder rolled softly in the distance. Emily stared ahead for several seconds. Then her eyes widened slowly. She looked frightened by her own thoughts. The questions tonight. Ethan waited. The house in Connecticut. She looked at him. My parents. Her breathing quickened slightly. Who I had talked to. Ethan felt his chest tighten. Emily sat very still now. Too still. Then toward the hallway outside. Then back toward Emily. Small details. Hidden conversations. Strange messages. Fear. Suddenly a soft knock came from the open doorway. Ethan turned immediately. A nurse stood there holding a small clear evidence bag. Dr. Brooks. Ethan stood. Yes. She looked confused. The paramedics found this in Mrs. Carter's coat pocket when they brought her in. Ethan took the bag and looked down. Inside sat a cell phone with a cracked screen. Richard Sterling's phone. Emily stared at it. Ethan stared at it. Then suddenly the damaged screen flickered back to life for one brief second before lighting the dark room with a new message across the display. Vanessa, I deleted the cameras like you asked.